Donald Trump freezes aid to Pakistan after complaining it supports terrorism. But will the White House turn a lukewarm ally into a bitter enemy? I'm Imran Gupta, and today's Newsmaker is the relationship between Pakistan and the United States. It's not hard to see why US President Donald Trump is upset. The United States gives billions of dollars to Islamabad. It's used to fight terrorism, build Pakistan's fledgling economy, and keep its nuclear weapons secure. In return, well, Pakistan still reportedly supports the Taliban and other Afghan fighters. And then there's that time Osama bin Laden was killed next to a Pakistani military academy. But while Trump complains the US is getting a bad deal, could freezing billions of dollars in aid be shooting his own military in the foot? Pakistan has responded by cutting ties with the US intelligence community. And if relations keep getting worse, US bases in Pakistan could be closed. As one US commentator put it, the US military would become a beached whale in landlocked Afghanistan. Basil Rehan reports.
We are suspending security assistance only to Pakistan at this time, until the Pakistani government takes decisive action against groups including the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network.
After months of threats, the US has acted on its word and suspended more than $1 billion in annual security assistance to Pakistan. The US says the country knowingly allows Taliban fighters and other militants to operate within its borders, hindering US military efforts. US officials are demanding immediate action to deal with the issue, but Islamabad denies the charge of fighting one group of terrorists but supporting another. Meanwhile, the US-Pakistan relationship is suffering, and cooperation on a range of issues from military to intelligence sharing are now at risk. The US is heavily reliant on Pakistan as a key supply route in the US-led war effort in neighboring Afghanistan. There is some concern Pakistan could retaliate by cutting US access to that route. They did it before over a previous disagreement in 2011. Many observers, however, believe this time is different. The new, more rigid US position on Pakistan is taking the two countries down an uncertain path. Pakistan may be less likely to choose taking a hard line in the face of a US ultimatum, to either placate an angry ally or turn its back on a long-standing friendship. Pakistan has received more than $33 billion in US aid since 2001. More than two-thirds of it is security support, according to congressional records. Most of what's been frozen is part of the Coalition Support Fund, which is money paid to Pakistan to cover costs associated with counter-terror operations. President Donald Trump says Pakistan is taking US money, but failing to fulfill the key objective of the agreement: to root out the terrorists.
Pakistan has much to gain from partnering with our effort in Afghanistan. It has much to lose by continuing to harbor criminals and terrorists.
Trump's public rebukes of Pakistan have at times horrified some of his more diplomatic peers. Among the most notable, the scathing New Year's Day tweet. The United States has foolishly given Pakistan more than $33 billion in aid over the last 15 years, and they've given us nothing but lies and deceit, thinking of our leaders as fools. They give safe haven to the terrorists we hunt in Afghanistan with little help, no more. Pakistanis see things differently. In an interview, TRT World's Crossing the Line, Pakistan's opposition leader pointed out that his country has been on the front line of the US-led war on terror since 2001. With devastating consequences.
Pakistan lost 70,000 people dead in this war, which had nothing to do with us, only on behest, fighting on the behest of Americans. Over $100 billion lost to the economy. And then to be blamed for the American total failure in Afghanistan, I think it's a travesty.
Imran Khan has long criticized Pakistan's ruling party for supporting the US-led campaign in Afghanistan. Today, the ruling party seems to be largely in agreement with Khan. Pakistan's foreign minister has decried the US allegations against it, going so far to say history shows Pakistan must be careful in trusting their US ally. So is the US unfairly singling out an ally, or is Pakistan the one stringing along an old friend? Basil Rehan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Pakistan's capital is Tariq Pirzada. He's a security and political analyst. From Islamabad, also, we have Imtiaz Gul. He's the founder and executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies, a think tank focused on Pakistan. In Washington, D.C., Jeff Smith. He's a research fellow at the Asian Studies Center of the Heritage Foundation. I thank you all for joining us. Tariq, let me ask you, is Trump doing the right thing because Pakistan fights one Taliban but supports another?
Well, you know, this allegation is not a new allegation. It has been leveled against Pakistan since the days of George W. Bush Jr., and that is the charge that continues even today. But the reality on the ground is that Pakistan has taken action in South Waziristan, has cleared that area. It has taken major military action and rather a series of actions in North Waziristan. That region has been cleared. Most of the Pakistan is not experiencing, widespread terrorism at all. The armed forces and the counter-terrorism forces are operating day and night. So there is no, number one. Number two, there is a charge, and this is a specific charge that I hear, that there is a network of there is a Haqqani network that is operating in Pakistan, and that there are other networks, Afghan Taliban networks operating in Pakistan. I can assure you one thing. Had there been any Taliban network operating in Pakistan, that would have been put an end to, because that is not in the interest of the Pakistani society. We have suffered a lot. Pakistani society is sick and tired of terrorism. We are sick and tired of the situation in Afghanistan.
Okay.
So if there is anybody in Pakistan or elsewhere, it could be some individuals, as they may be anywhere in the world. But as far as the networks are concerned, their back has been broken and there is no proof, and the United States has not provided any evidence on that.
Okay, so something that Tariq said, I'm going to take and pose to Imtiaz. The point that the Americans and the Afghans are making, yes, Pakistan is quiet and you're taking care of terrorists in Pakistan. But the problem is it's the terrorists that are attacking Afghanistan and US and NATO interests across the border that Pakistan is at worst supporting, at best turning a blind eye to. That's the charge. Imtiaz, does it check out at all?
Well, I think a very recent report yesterday, actually, from Agence France Presse says that the last 6 months have seen about 20 major attacks in the capital city of Kabul, and they've all been claimed by Daesh. And Daesh is the enemy of the Taliban, of the Haqqani network. So the report also suggests that all Daesh or IS networks are operating under the nose of NDS and the Afghan security establishment. So there is some sort of disconnect. Of course, Pakistan has been taking sides, but these preferences are driven, as far as Pakistan is concerned, as much by geopolitical considerations as the geopolitical considerations drive and influence the American partnerships with non-state actors in Syria, in Iraq, with the Kurds. The Turkish Kurds are called by President Erdogan, for instance, terrorists, whereas they have been receiving support from the US. US publicly has been sponsoring and arming non-state actors against the Syrian government. So this is the charge, while the charge may be true, but this is not typical to Pakistan alone.
Okay,
Every country
that's interesting.
hedges.
Interesting point. Okay, so Jeff Smith, on the one hand, one guest is saying it's not happening. The other guest is saying while it might be happening, you do the same. So why are you, why are you pointing out our flaws? Do not look at the speck in your brother's eye and ignore the plank in your own. Is the US scapegoating Pakistan for its failures in Afghanistan?
No, absolutely not. And the notion that there are no Taliban militants operating in Pakistan is not only ridiculous, frankly, it's quite offensive. Anybody who's looked at this question, in fact, every intelligence organization around the world and every objective analyst around the world that has looked at this question has found that there are indeed many militant groups operating inside Pakistan, and that Many of these groups have received support from the Pakistani state and intelligence services.
Can you mention the name of any group?
That is an objective
Can you tell us the name of any group that is operating in Pakistan?
By everybody who is not in Pakistan.
Can you tell us the name of any network that is operating in Pakistan? Can name it. Please name it.
I can start with the Haqqani network, which is the deadliest militant outfit that's currently operating in Afghanistan.
Haqqani network does not exist in Pakistan. They have 43% of Afghan territory under their control. Sure. Why would they need to operate from Pakistan? Kindly counter my argument. They have 43%
sure. The reason they operate from
Pakistan is... Why would they operate from Pakistan?
Okay, go ahead, Jeff. Okay, you asked the question, Tariq. Tariq, you asked the question. Go ahead, Jeff.
Sure. The reason they operate from Pakistan is because it is almost impossible to defeat an insurgency that has safe haven inside the borders of a neighboring state. This is sort of counterinsurgency 101 and is the principal reason that we've been unable to find peace and stability in Afghanistan. It's because Pakistan is playing a double game that we're all very well aware of, and that, in fact, this game has been rather successful.
That's an allegation.
Pakistan is seeking a government in Afghanistan that is weak and unstable. In fact, I think it wants a government in Afghanistan that is very friendly and very anti-India, but it knows the Afghan people will never vote such a government into power because they are now deeply hostile to Pakistan after 10 years of this mess. So if it cannot have a pliable and submissive government in Kabul, Pakistan wants to see an unstable and divided government in Afghanistan.
Okay, Tariq, address that.
Why? Let me answer that. Look, Pakistan's interest lies in having a very stable government in Afghanistan. The point that the gentleman has raised from Washington, that the government in Kabul is weak, that confirms the fact that the United States has failed to actually create a government, support a government that can function effectively. It has failed to establish an environment in Afghanistan that is free of terror, that is free of Daesh, and because that is the fact, that proves that not only the United States has failed in Afghanistan, that is trying to malign Pakistan by bringing a plethora of charges against it.
Okay, so that's the Pakistani claim, scapegoating. Right, okay, fair enough. Let me bring in Imtiaz Gulia. Imtiaz, the Pakistanis feel very deeply that their sacrifices in the war on terror haven't been recognized by the United States and others. I was speaking to opposition politician Imran Khan recently, and he's on the same page as the government right now on this issue. He said, you know, we lost 70,000 lives in the war on terror. The Americans don't even recognize that. They don't even realize that Pakistan made tremendous human sacrifices in this war on terror, fighting America's war as they find it. So, Imtiaz, if the United States was more sensitive to this, that the Pakistanis had a huge cost in this war on terror, would tensions be, I guess, would they die down a little bit? Would it make it easier? Is it an issue of optics here, the Americans not respecting the Pakistanis?
Well, I think the issue is much deeper, and following the January 1st tweet by President Trump, I think there's a lot of skepticism into the motives behind these allegations, because if we were to look at Afghanistan, now this is not an issue between Pakistan, the US, or Pakistan and Afghanistan, or Afghanistan and India alone. This is a multilateral issue which is being driven by geopolitical considerations. And the big question that we must all ask of ourselves is that Iran and Pakistan constitute the two major strategic neighbors of Afghanistan. Now, the United States wants to secure a peace in Afghanistan to the exclusion of Iran, the other strategic neighbor. This is, I would say, ridiculous, because Iran also has about 1,200 kilometer long border with Afghanistan, and the Americans have their bases up in the south, which Iranians are not comfortable with. So just to suggest that the entire string of militancy or terrorism is coming from Pakistan is ludicrous, if not ridiculous. Okay. Also, borne out by the fact that there are sanctuaries which are home to anti-Pakistan terrorists, and the American drones have taken them out.
Okay.
Now, whether Pakistan is sheltering those soldiers or those forces which are hunting the American forces, that is then also denied by the recent report, as I stated earlier, by AFP, which says the last major 20 attacks have been carried out by the IS, Daesh, and not any other group.
And that's an interesting point, and there are also reports that the Russians and the Iranians are supporting the Taliban in some forms, and they have been over the past couple of years. Jeff, I want you to have a little listen to what Pakistan's Foreign Minister Khawaja Asif had to say to me just a few weeks ago. Have a little listen, and I've got a question for you off the back of that.
We play their proxies, and then whenever their interest is served, or whenever their objectives are achieved, they wash their hands off and go away. And that doesn't serve my interest, the interest of my people, people of Pakistan. And Iran is our next door neighbor. We share centuries of history. And China is a very, very trusted friend.
So you know what he's saying, Jeff? He's saying they use us, they wash their hands, and now we have options. So basically go to hell. That's what he's been saying. And he's saying we have the Iranians, we have the Chinese. So if Trump is going to cut aid, what's that going to do? Because the Pakistanis are clearly pivoting to the Chinese and the Iranians. How is it actually tangibly going to do anything different?
Well, I don't know that many people here actually expect a fundamental change in Pakistan's behavior from this recession of U.S. aid. You know, I think the fundamental argument many Pakistanis make is that America is paying money to compensate them for security operations, to compensate them for doing what America wants them to do. And while I would wholeheartedly support the idea of providing Pakistan a tremendous amount of aid to root out these militants, because it is difficult, because it is costly, they're simply not doing so, which is why I think the aid needs to be curtailed. But it is not an American imperative or an American operation. Let
me answer that.
If you have sovereignty, sovereignty comes with responsibility, and you have responsibility to patrol your own borders and ensure that your own borders are not being used to launch attacks against other countries. That is your responsibility as a sovereign nation.
Let me just talk about that.
That is not something you're entitled to receive compensation
Tariq responds
for.
to that. Give us a response to that.
Very quickly, Pakistan is a sovereign country not because of the guarantees of the United States. Pakistan is a sovereign country in its own right, number one. The war that we are fighting, we have been fighting for the last 16 years. This was a US-imposed war on terror. There was no terror being perpetrated in Pakistan in 2001. And actually there was none until 2004 when the first suicide attack happened in Pakistan. So let me advise my friend that think before you talk. You are actually taking it for granted that the United States has not imposed any cost on Pakistan. We have lost $120 billion in terms of economic loss, loss of investment in Pakistan, and because of the instability inculcated into our land, because of the US policy, no Pakistani was involved in the attack on the World Trade Center. So all this talk about Pakistan being a culprit, Pakistan being responsible for US failure in Afghanistan, Pakistan being responsible for US failure elsewhere in the world, that is a hogwash. Okay. Somebody has to understand.
So, okay, fair enough. And you made the point strongly. Jeff, your response to that very briefly before I go to Imtiaz for final thoughts. Jeff?
Pakistan has borne great costs from this struggle. In fact, maybe the most costs. The greatest victims of these fanatics have been Pakistani citizens, frankly. Some 50,000 have been killed. But they haven't been killed because of the United States. They've been killed because Pakistan has allowed
because of supporting the U.S. policy
to fester in its border regions.
Pakistan is being seen as an evil
and has
supported
many of
the U.S. policy.
Okay, listen, I have to wrap very quickly. And I think both of you have made your points very clearly. Imtiaz Gul, let me bring you in and just kind of step back for a second and ask you, How far are we from the point of no return when we look at this straining relationship, and who's losing more, the United States or Pakistan?
Well, I think the U.S. Former Special Representative and Ambassador Richard Olson has also in an article very clearly spelled out that probably the U.S. would lose more, because if Pakistan doesn't cooperate in Afghanistan, U.S. troops in Afghanistan would be like a stranded whale. So all I would like to say is that the United States has seen the consequences, deadly consequences of its geopolitics, starting from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. So to suggest that it's just the United States that wants democracy all over the world and is pursuing just peace all over the region, all over the world, I don't think that somehow gels with the real ground situation in Afghanistan or in Iraq. I think this is a very, very complicated situation created by the geopolitics of the United States. We have suffered, they're also suffering, and so is Afghanistan. Some leaders there are investing in their continued stability or instability by lapping up the American and the Indian narrative on Pakistan.
Okay. Imtiaz Go, Tariq Pirzada and Jeff Smith. I've got to wrap, but it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And just another reminder, you can watch my full interview with opposition leader Imran Khan during our new episode of Crossing the Line, premiering this Saturday at 19:30 GMT, right here on TRT World. Coming up, violent protests spread across Tunisia, 7 years after the Arab Spring toppled their leader. And peace talks between Colombia's government and the ELN rebels collapse. We ask, who's to blame? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Tunisians are fed up with the rising price of basic goods. Violent demonstrations have broken out across the country, and the number of injured protesters and police is climbing. As banks and post offices are torched, some people are asking if the unrest has the markings of a new revolution, or are they simply the growing pains of a young democracy that began with the Arab Spring 7 years ago. Here's Sandra Gatman.
The government doesn't know how to rule. The president and his people are corrupt.
It's been a week of outrage on the streets of Tunisia. The government has brought in new price hikes for goods like cars and phones to shrink its budget deficit. But protesters say the cuts will hurt the poorest most.
They increased income tax by 1%. If a father of a poor family loses 10 dinars a month, that's 6 or 8 litres of milk he can no longer buy.
Days of violent confrontations in several regions have led to hundreds of arrests and dozens of injured police officers. The government is accusing young vandals and looters of being behind most of the unrest. In one town, a man was killed, and demonstrators blame the police.
What these people want is to display mistakes by the security forces against protesters in order to fuel popular discontent.
Rumblings of popular discontent tend to cause concern that Tunisia might go through another revolution. The country has often been singled out for its relatively smooth democratic transition after the overthrow of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in 2011. But 7 years after the Arab Spring, 9 successive governments have failed to fix Tunisia's economy.
The Middle East.
The International Monetary Fund has put pressure on Tunisia and its neighbors to do better.
The region needs to take action to address those challenges and leverage today's opportunities so everyone can benefit.
Tunisia agreed to a $2.8 billion loan program in return for economic reforms.
The government's top priority, even when making tough decisions, is to improve the economic and social conditions of the people and return trust in their country.
But that trust appears at its most fragile in years, as protests intensify and the army moves in. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tunis is Mahrazia Labidi. She's an MP with the Ennahda party in the ruling coalition, as well as a former Vice President of Parliament. Also in Tunis is Nouris Dozi. She's an activist and one of the protest leaders with the Fashionista New campaign. Also joining us is Adel Abdelghaffar. He's a North Africa expert and a fellow on foreign policy at the Brookings Doha Center. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Mahrazia Labidi, let me begin with you. All these people protesting, is that an admission that your government's austerity measures have failed?
No, not really. You know, sir, it's not a big number. Of course, any protestation shall be taken into account, but we have very few protests in the day. But we have gangs or bands of young by night attacking some cars or attacking institutions, burning here and there some institutions, but they are not really protesters, organized protesters. We have the impression, indeed, that these are simply people vandalizing and committing violent acts, but protest is accepted and it's normal in a democracy.
Okay, so Nouris, these are gangs and vandals. These aren't huge protests, according to a politician in Parliament.
The first sparkle of the revolution was actually one guy. And let me also answer this campaign and the systematic campaign of distortion that it is only to discredit and to intimidate people in order not to protest against this financial act.
Mahrazia Labidi and Adel Abdelghaffar, I'll bring you in soon. Mahrazia, right, we have hundreds of people who have been arrested. People are getting hurt on the streets. They're talking about the economy. They're saying this 2018 budget is not for us. We can't find money for food. We can't find money for the basics. Isn't it a bit unfair to just call these people gangsters and to call them vandals? Why don't you listen to them?
I haven't. Yes, I haven't called all of them. I said that protesters are protected by law. And protesting against any measure taken by the government or any law is a constitutional right. But so far, we are not having that much protesters. We are having each night from 10 to the morning, some gangs here and there burning institutions, and this is not a protest. These are acts of violence. This is what we are refusing. But of course, any protester in democratic Tunisia protesting against finance law, against the increase of prices, it's his and her right to protest, and we shall protect them.
Okay,
so, there is difference between two acts.
Let me ask Nouris. So
Nouris, people arrested, people arrested, and those are those who committed act of violence, not protesters.
Okay, fair enough. So Nouris, let me try and separate this out and look at proportion, right? So the government will point to the fact that a Jewish school was bombed, petrol bombed. They will point to the fact that there's been some looting and arson, and they will say, this is why this isn't a broad protest movement, and this is why these are just people committing acts of violence. Tell me why you disagree.
No, this is just the government is trying to divide protesters and people, and the Tunisian people, again, using religion for the second time in our history. people in Tunisia have always lived peacefully until this government is using religious in its most ridiculous ways. This is not acceptable, and I would like also to make a further statement of how this former ex-congresswoman would reply to the fact that how can a philosophy teacher is integrated in hooliganism and riot? And we've also seen videos of police officers filming strangers, robbing and stealing and spreading terror in the neighborhood, and they did nothing. They did not arrest them. They just stood filming these people and they did not make arrests. So I am simply saying that these people are protected by police officers and by the government itself in order to make a systematic campaign about distortion, in order to not encourage people to go down and protest about this financial act. And let me also remind you of something else. It is ridiculous and despicable to talk about this financial act because it is just impoverishment of people, the people that these people have sworn to be at his service and at the service of the country.
Okay. Adil Abdel Ghaffar, which of the two women, in your opinion,
yes,
hold on, Mehrazia, just a second, ma'am, if you don't mind. Adil, which of the two women have a closer interpretation to the truth? Who's got a stronger handle of what's going on right now?
Well, I argue, I find it quite unfortunate that it's characterized, that the protests are characterized as gangs and looters. And it actually reminds us of the discourse of bin Ali and Mubarak. But I feel that the protesters have very legitimate concerns because 7 years after the Arab uprisings and after all of the aspirations of the millions of youth who took to the streets, not only in Tunis but also across the region, have remains unmet. Arguably, the political transition in Tunisia has been more successful than the economic one. Matter of fact, the economics have actually worsened. Unemployment sits at 15%. Youth unemployment sits at 37%. Inflation is higher. Tourism, which is a lifeline of the economy, 10% of the economy approximately, is down due to terrorist attacks. And amidst all of this economic issues, the government decides to raise taxes and cut subsidies, and the prices have skyrocketed. Of course, there's going to be a response from the Tunisian street.
Okay, so Mehrazia Al-Abidi, aren't you worried that we're seeing the same pattern unfolding? Bouazizi was protesting because of the economy. The government was calling the protesters looters and vandals and so on. People were upset at the price of goods and they felt they didn't have the political freedoms that they needed. Aren't we seeing a similar pattern to 2011? Isn't it going to be dangerous for US government to just dismiss them as nothing and just gangs at night? Isn't something big happening just under your nose and you're missing out on it?
I can understand the anger and the awareness of my interlocutor and their maybe vision, because they are not in, I am in Tunis and on daily basis, and I cross streets on the nights. This is why I'm giving a witness from reality. Protesters are respected. Those who are protesting today in front of ministers, they are protected and they are listened to. My party, which is in the coalition, now the party is calling the government to listen to the legitimate demands of protesters and of reviewing measures concerning poor families and needy people. Yet, I repeat, Not all protesters are looters, but what is happening is that there are many acts of violence and happening by night, and we want to be firm on this. But that doesn't mean that we are describing all protesters as illegal. Our duty as politicians in a democratic country, we are building democracy, is to listen to our people. And you know, the government is between two pressures: the pressure of the requirements of reforms, the requirements also of international institutions like the fund of the FME, and the requirement of our, and the demand of our people. And of course, Tunisian people have to be listened to, and very soon we are calling the government to take due measures. But we are firm against any people or those who are calling for violence. And they were not only condemned by politicians, they are condemned even by Tunisian people. They have not joined these acts of violence. But protesting is a constitutional right protected in Tunisia.
Got it loud and
I want
clear.
to reassure my interlocutors.
No risk. So let me ask you, we have Prime Minister Youssef Chahid trying to assure his people that 2018 would be the last difficult year. That's why he said we need austerity. The protesters, you disagree with the austerity measures. People are saying we can't pay for basic goods. And things have unfolded. There's been violence on the streets. Let me ask you, moving forward, if the government comes to you and says we will replace the budget, we'll rethink the budget, we will lower prices, will the protests stop?
We are not a political core. We are not asking for the downfall of the government. It is not our business. We are just a spontaneous regroupment of people, a campaign that is asking for the suspension of the Financial Act. That's it.
Adil?
Yes, I agree with the demands. Of course, rolling back some of these austerity measures, but also we have to look at the longer term picture here. There is a main issue that there's always been a discrepancy in development between the north and the south, between the urban areas and the rural areas. And it's not a surprise that actually the spark of the Arab uprising started in South Tunisia, in Sidi Bouzid by Bouazizi, in one of the more underdeveloped areas of the country, socioeconomically marginalized. There were also protests last year in Kasserine, as well as in Gafsa. So all of these areas suffer immensely. And historically, the northern areas have been receiving much more public and private investment at the expense of developing the south. So even though if the government overturns these austerity measures in the short term, the structural problems will remain, that a big chunk of the country receives much less development planning or money.
And Adil, do you believe that this ruling coalition, Nida Tunis and Ennahda, has been hurt over the past week?
They have been hurt 100% because they have not been able to deliver on the economic front. Yes, on the political front, by virtue of them actually being in coalition and things stabilizing politically, they have succeeded. But on the economic front, they have failed, and the coming election, the municipal local election, will be a chance for the Tunisian public to voice their concerns, and through voting and through democratic processes against this ruling coalition, who has so far failed to deliver economically, and perhaps it's time for some fresh ideas.
Okay, Mehrazia, the ruling coalition has failed to deliver economically, according to Adil. Respond to that.
You know, this indeed, there is a difficulty to deliver the economic development, but even for all the success of government after the revolution, that doesn't mean that this coalition has failed or that before. That means that the economic issue is a hard one, that we need national unity to face it, and we need time. We need time to make balance between regions. We need time to deliver jobs and to invite investors. Let's take, for example, this act of violence against the Jewish community venue of prayer, doesn't it hurt tourism? While we are recovering from the other, let's say, crisis of tourism. So what is really despicable, as my interlocutor said, is those who think that or push protesters to hurt more Tunisian economy. And in hurting Tunisian economy, of course, they are hurting not only the achievements of the government, but also the achievements of Tunisian people. What we are trying to do is to listen to our people, to remedy by measures in favor of needy and poor classes, and in favor of Tunisian citizens, and to continue on towards economy and towards also economic achievements.
Understood.
Together, in respect of law and of democracy in Tunisia. And thank you. Thank you to my interlocutors also.
Fair enough. Final word to Norris, because we're running out of time.
Thank you.
You have a politician pleading, give us time. These are the early days of democracy. Give us time to make it work. Will you give them time?
We have just given enough years, so I think 7 years is enough time. And I just need to say one thing: leave the Jewish alone. Stop politicizing religious stuff, okay? The Jewish was not attacked
tell to
by
those
the
who attacked
protesters.
them,
Just
not
leave
to
it,
us.
just
We
leave
are
it
protecting
alone,
them.
man. Just leave it alone.
Yes,
The
we are
sons
protecting-
that you've
we are protecting
protecting
all
in the
Tunisians,
Troika
all
had
citizens,
actually
all
attacked
Tunisians, all
Jewish,
Tunisians.
atheists, Christians, and even artists. So just leave it alone that way. And it is just ridiculous to talk about
you are not living in
democracy
Tunisia,
and
you know
coalition
nothing
at the
about
same
it.
time.
Here,
and
all
how would you
respected.
also
Here,
describe
no, please,
the police raids in their home, arresting 2 minors, taking them from their own homes? How would you describe arresting a philosophy teacher who is called Ahmed Sesi and telling him and arresting him and charging him of vandalism? This is just ridiculous and a dishonest way to justify your action. And let me tell you something else. The ruling party, Al Nahda, had just claimed to launch a campaign which is called Fadl Case. So really, just pick up a stand and stick to it.
I understand her anger, but it's clear that she is not living in Tunisia. She is describing a situation just hearing about.
Okay, but she is, and you disagree.
Let me tell you
this is why.
That
Mehrazia, unfortunately,
yes,
Mehrazia, I'm sorry to come in.
Respect her,
and I apologize because we've out of time.
I respect her. I respect her opinion.
And this is
but
why
this is not the truth in Tunisia.
Okay, we are very happy to have all of you on the program. Opinions differ, and this is why we have this program. I thank you, Norris, Mehrazia, and Adil Abdel
This is not the truth in Tunisia.
Thanks all of you for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
The national government deplores the decision by the ELN to resume its terrorist actions against the civilian population, the armed forces, and infrastructure. The national government was always willing to extend the ceasefire with that organization and quickly negotiate a new one.
Year-long peace talks between the Colombian government and the rebel National Liberation Army, or ELN, have come to an abrupt stop. It happened after a ceasefire expired and within hours, attacks on government targets started up again. President Juan Manuel Santos condemned them and pulled his negotiators out of Ecuador, where the talks were being held. Now, to have a look at how all of this happened and what happens next, let's talk to Carlos Caicedo in London. He specializes in assessing risk in Latin America for IHS Markit, a global advisory firm. Carlos, thank you very much for joining us. Has Santos done the right thing here? Ceasefire ends, ELN step up their attacks, he pulls out of peace talks. Is that the right move?
Yeah, I think he was put on a very, very difficult position because the ELN has not been 100% committed to this peace process. There has been significant breaches of the agreement over the last 3 months. There have been some kidnapping, there has been some attacks on security forces. Obviously, they accuse mutually of not being faithful to the agreement. At the same time, there is a major backlash against the previous peace process with the FARC. And therefore, to make excessive concession to the ELN politically would be highly counterproductive for President Santos. The other thing which is very difficult to manage is the ELN is not a fully centralized organization, unlike the FARC, which have total control over its fighters. The problem with the ELN is that lack of centralization, and therefore there is a scope for mistakes.
Yeah, and I think that two of the things that are sort of settled and guaranteed is that the ELN by no means has the firepower that the FARC had. It's a much smaller group. And the other one is that they've tried to fill themselves or plug themselves into the gaps once the peace deal with the FARC materialized. Now that that has happened, is the ELN maybe testing the waters because they saw what the FARC got? They saw that the FARC could fight the government for decades by conducting acts of what is called terrorism around the world, and eventually they can end up in suits and maybe even in government. So why should you actually have a peace deal without getting everything you want before then?
Well, I think that's partially true, because if you look at the previous agreement with the FARC, there were moments like this in which there was a significant breakdown in the agreement. The FARC went and for a couple of weeks started blowing up different infrastructure assets, and then 2 weeks later they came back to the negotiating table. This actually could happen again here, but then what happened in the next couple of weeks would be a significant indicator of that. Also, the mediation of the Catholic Church and the United Nations would be also an important factor here. But the bottom line is it would be very difficult for Santos to make concessions when you are in the run-up to an election in which you need to be seen and perceived as strong on security. So it's a very difficult balance for President Santos at the moment.
Okay, that's interesting, because you'd think that here's a man who wants to live up to his Nobel Peace Prize, and that was related to the FARC, but you're saying he has to be tough in the run-up to election. How tough can he get without maybe risking another full-blown insurgency and just strengthening the hand of the ELN?
Well, I think we need to put the ELN in the right dimension. This is not the FARC. If you see the 4 attacks that happened, it was only on 3 eastern provinces, Casanare, Arauca, and Boyacá. And the security forces claim that there is only 1,200 fighters. This is compared with the FARC that was a proper national army. So I think it wouldn't be good for the country. It would be a mild setback for Santos, but the ELN does not have the military capability to inflict the damage that the FARC. So in many ways, it would be also in the interest of the ELN to understand this, that they're not going to get all the concessions that the FARC did, especially in this environment where there is a significant body of opinion against excessive concession to guerrillas that carry on destroying national infrastructure. So I will say it would be a setback, but not a major setback. Militarily, the ELN is not exactly the FARC, has not the capability to lead a new wave of insurgency in Colombia.
Yeah, I understand that they're making themselves a bit richer by expanding their role in the drugs trade ever since the FARC demobilization. It's the ELN plus some former far-right paramilitaries. They're wiggling into those gaps and making some cash in the drugs trade. You're not extremely worried, but if I had to ask you, what does the ELN want politically? In a nutshell, what do they want?
Well, they want the problem with the ELN is they want politically more concession than the FARC. For example, the ELN has said all along that they want the nationalization of the oil industry, for example. They don't want U.S. multinational to operate in Colombia. For you to demand that, you really need an immense military force, which the ELN does not have. The reason why there was a peace process with the FARC was precisely because the demands of FARC were relatively modest. And if you demand the nationalization of the whole oil industry, you will go nowhere. So the ELN will need to downgrade their demands, and that would be something that is going to be discussed again and again, but that is a red line. The Colombian government is not going to guarantee to offer such a big concession, not only because the majority of the country is now pacified, but also because militarily, really the ELN is a relatively small guerrilla compared with the FARC.
And given that they're so small, and just a couple thousand fighters, if Santos had to order the military to go and crush them, even however difficult that might be, but if he did that and they did crush them, would the Colombian people support it?
I think so. I think there is a significant rejection of the Colombian population to the guerrilla 50 years of a continuous war. It's quite clear that there is no significant support of the civilian population. I think with the alien could do a lot of damages by joining forces with the drug trafficking gangs, but even there, I think the Colombian has the capability to hit them quite hard. In fact, there is a new law being approved by Congress which allows the military to use U.S. aircraft and firepower against criminal gangs, and that would be deployed in those areas in which the ALN want to operate. The thing is, the government just want to complete the task and pacify the country totally, but if that's not possible, then they have to deal with the ELN in a different way.
Carlos Caicedo, thanks so much for your insight. It's been good to talk to you here on the Newsmakers.
You're welcome.
And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gavda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.